Laura's office at City Hall had never felt so small. The blinds were half-drawn against the cold grey light of Port Charles, and the muted hum of the building seeped through the walls like distant static. Stacks of campaign folders, polling reports, and half-drunk cups of coffee cluttered her desk, a battlefield of paper and porcelain that told the story of months of relentless fighting. Laura Collins stood amid it all, arms crossed, fingers digging into her sleeves as if holding herself together by force. On the wall behind her, a framed photo of the Waterfront Revitalization Project smiled back at her, a reminder of victories already won. But tonight, the smile felt like a taunt. As she spoke quietly with Jordan Ashford, Laura's words carried the weight of someone braced for loss. The polls had tightened, the last-minute attacks had landed, and doubt, sharp and insistent, had found its way into a heart that had weathered decades of storms. Jordan stood near the corner of the room, tablet in hand, her posture disciplined but her eyes soft with concern. She had seen Laura face kidnappings, blackmail, crises that would have broken lesser people. But there was something uniquely cruel about this kind of battlefield, a war fought in headlines and whispers, about change and new blood, all dressed up around the name Ezra Boyle. The numbers coming in throughout the day had not been kind. Every update had shaved away another sliver of hope, until Laura had begun to speak about the future as if it already belonged to someone else. She tried to joke about it, tried to accept it with grace, but the words tasted like ash. Loss in politics was not just about ego, it was about the people who would be left behind if the wrong person stepped into power. That was what gnawed at her now. Jordan, for her part, had tried to keep Laura tethered to reality without crushing what was left of her optimism. She pointed out the precincts that hadn't reported yet, the neighborhoods that traditionally backed Laura even when the polls predicted otherwise. But underneath her calm exterior, even Jordan could feel the tension tightening around them. Port Charles had become a city standing on a fault line, rattled by corruption scandals, shaken by violent incidents, and desperate for stability. The wrong leadership could turn cracks into chasms. Jordan knew how hard Laura had fought to hold the city together, but she also knew that politics rarely rewarded sincerity. The people cared, yes, but they also got tired, distracted, seduced by shiny promises and slick new faces on glossy campaign posters. Ezra Boyle had specialized in that kind of seduction. The door swung open without much ceremony, and Drew Kane stepped inside, carrying the charged energy of a man who'd already made up his mind. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The tension in the room thickened as his gaze swept over Laura and Jordan. The lines around his eyes were deeper tonight, carved by sleepless nights and the strain of watching a campaign he'd backed drift toward what he believed was inevitable defeat. Drew had once been the symbol of second chances and resilience, the man who fought his way back from identity theft, brainwashing, and immeasurable loss. But in the relentless calculus of politics, even someone like Drew could be pushed into brutal pragmatism. He didn't need official numbers to know, or so he thought. The donors, the insiders, the friends, who always seemed to know which way the wind was blowing, they had all started speaking of Ezra Boyle as if he were already sitting behind Laura's desk. Drew had listened. He'd watched. And somewhere along the line, hope had quietly given way to strategy. As he crossed the room, his voice carried a tone that was at once gentle and unyielding. They needed to think ahead, he told Laura. The city couldn't afford chaos or a contested narrative. If Ezra was going to take office in the morning, then Laura needed to decide what kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind tonight. A graceful concession, public support for Ezra's leadership, an appeal for unity, those were the things Drew believed could protect Port Charles from further dividing itself. That was what he said out loud. What he didn't say was that he was tired of losing battles by clinging too tightly to ideals. He had seen too many people crushed under the weight of their own principles. In the quiet corners of his mind, another thought whispered, sometimes survival meant recognizing when to step aside and make peace with the enemy you didn't choose. He framed it as strategy, as maturity, as realism. But Laura heard something else in his words: surrender. Not just of an election, but of the moral compass that had once made Drew Cain a man she trusted implicitly. Laura's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something more complicated, a mixture of hurt and disbelief. She had expected pessimism, she had expected him to be blunt. She had not expected him to walk into her office already speaking as if the city had moved on without her. She remembered a time when Drew had believed in impossible odds, had thrown himself in front of corrupt systems and dangerous men because he refused to let fear dictate his choices. Now, he was asking her to stand beside someone she did not believe was ready to lead simply because the numbers looked grim. She listened, let him finish, and then quietly pushed back. She reminded him of who he had been before political calculation began to harden his edges. The man who had fought for his family at all costs. The man who had walked into chaos again and again, not because it was smart, but because it was right. She spoke of the people who had placed their hope in her name on a ballot, not because she promised miracles, but because she represented continuity, integrity, and a kind of stubborn decency this city rarely saw in its leaders. If she lost, she would concede with grace. She would step aside without clinging or casting doubt on the process. But she would not preemptively kneel to Ezra Boyle in her own heart before the last vote was counted. And she would not encourage Drew to become someone who made peace with outcomes before they were even real. Jordan watched the exchange in silence, her chest tight. She knew both of them too well, the mayor who carried the city's burdens on her shoulders, and the man who had reluctantly stepped into the game of power out of a desire to protect what mattered. To see them at odds like this, so close to the moment of truth, was painful. And yet Jordan knew something they didn't. In her hand, on the tablet whose screen remained locked, lay the results they were fighting over in theory. The final precincts had come in. The recounts had been resolved. The numbers, now fixed, told a story neither of them fully expected. Jordan felt the irony like a live wire under her skin. She held back, for a few moments longer, letting the conversation play out. It mattered that Drew heard Laura's words, that he was forced to look at himself in the mirror she held up. It mattered that Laura, even standing in the perceived shadow of defeat, refused to compromise who she was. This was not just an election, it was a crossroads for all three of them. What kind of leaders would they be when the lights went down and the cameras were off? Jordan knew that the result she was about to announce would change the trajectory of that question, but it wouldn't erase the choices being made in this room. Those would linger, shaping trust and alliances long after tonight. Finally, Jordan stepped forward, her voice cutting through the charged silence. She addressed Laura first, because that was where this story had started, long before Ezra Boyle ever decided to chase power. Her words were calm, but the tremor beneath them betrayed how monumental the moment really was. The race, she informed them, was over. The final numbers were in. There had been no last-minute collapse, no fatal swing toward Ezra. Against the odds, against the narrative that had already begun forming in the back channels of the city, Port Charles had voted. And it had chosen Laura Collins. The margin was solid, not a fluke or a recount trap. She had not merely survived, she had convincingly won. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The world seemed to tilt. Laura's breath caught in her throat as if she'd forgotten how to inhale. The weight that had been crushing her chest didn't simply lift, it shattered. Relief came first, sharp and overwhelming, followed closely by something deeper, a fierce, grateful joy tinged with awe. The people had not abandoned her. They had seen the attacks, the glossy ads, the alternative Ezra had promised, and still chosen her steadier, quieter path. She thought of the families in the old neighborhoods, the small business owners who had shaken her hand at town halls, the nurses and teachers and longshore workers who had lined up to tell her their fears. Their decision tonight felt like a whispered chorus rising up through the streets, "We still believe in you." Drew's reaction could not have been more different. His head snapped toward Jordan, eyes narrowing in confusion, then widening in shock. The certainty he had carried in with him cracked apart like glass dropped on tile. Ezra lost. The thought didn't fit into the mental structure he had spent the day building. Part of him had already begun adjusting to a city under new management, had started preparing himself to navigate a world where Ezra's name would be on the office door instead of Laura's. To realize now that he had been wrong, not just about the numbers, but about the spirit of the city, hit him harder than he expected. He replayed his own words in his mind, asking Laura to lend her voice to Ezra's future, encouraging her to step aside with elegance, to offer support to a man who would never have done the same for her. A prickle of shame crawled up the back of his neck. If he had walked in even 5 minutes later, after Jordan had spoken, the conversation would have been entirely different. He would have congratulated Laura, praised her resilience, reminded her that he'd believed in her all along. It would have been a comfortable lie. But he hadn't been given that luxury. Instead, the truth of who he had become in the shadow of fear had been exposed under the harshest possible light. Laura turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw not gloating, but something far more cutting, disappointment layered over relief. She didn't say anything cruel, didn't throw his pessimism back in his face. She didn't have to. The silence between them said enough. Drew realized that he had not just underestimated Laura, he had underestimated the people she served. He had trusted the whispers of power brokers more than the voices of ordinary citizens. He had forgotten the lesson Laura embodied every day, that Port Charles, for all its darkness and brokenness, still had a stubborn, beating heart that refused to be bought or manipulated. Jordan, watching them both, understood that this victory would be remembered not for the margin of ballots, but for the fault lines it exposed. Laura would step before the cameras soon, not to concede, but to accept. She would deliver a speech about unity and perseverance, about rebuilding trust and moving forward together. She would probably, in her own magnanimous way, still reach out to Ezra's supporters and invite them into the conversation. That was who she was. But in private, behind the closed doors of this office, a new reality had settled in. She knew now whom she could rely on when the ground shook and whom she would have to watch a little more carefully. Drew would have to decide what to do with the mirror Laura had held up to him in these last fragile minutes before the truth arrived. He could double down on cynicism, pretend he'd simply been realistic, or he could let the sting of being wrong crack something open in him. Maybe this was the moment he needed, not the triumph of having backed the right winner, but the humbling realization that somewhere along the way, he had abandoned the very courage that had once defined him. In that sense, Laura's victory was not just hers, it was an invitation for everyone around her to remember who they were before fear and fatigue began to rewrite their values. As the noise from the hallway grew, footsteps, voices, the inevitable knock signaling that the press was assembling and the city was ready to hear from its mayor, Laura straightened her shoulders. The doubt that had haunted her all day was gone, replaced by a calm determination. The office no longer felt like a shrinking room, but like the command center of a city still worth fighting for. Jordan moved to her side, a steady presence ready to face whatever political storms would come next. Drew remained a few steps back, caught between the man he'd been, the man he'd almost become, and the man he still had the chance to be. Outside, Port Charles glittered with the lights of 1,000 windows and the restless movement of people who did not yet know the final result, but would soon. Some would cheer. Some would curse. Some would shrug and go back to their lives. But inside this office, cramped, messy, and charged with the aftershock of a narrative rewritten at the last second, the future of the city had already begun to shift. The election had ended in Laura's favor, but the story was only beginning. For Laura, it was a reaffirmation. For Jordan, a warning that vigilance would be needed more than ever. And for Drew, it was a quiet, devastating revelation. The city he thought had lost its heart had just proven it still had one. The question now was whether he would find his again.